So my understanding is that the government actually announced a cut of $42 million from the Indigenous Legal Aid and Policy Reform Program just prior to the federal election. It would appear to be a cut of about 15% of what is budgeted over the forward estimates. That was an announcement that was made before the election, is my understanding. I'm interested to know what we're hearing now is that in fact that isn't a cut that is going to necessarily be followed through on. Naturally, the agencies that are within that program are anxious to have some certainty about what will be happening and what that cut might mean to them on the ground. What I'd like to ask first of all is, can you advise what proportion of that program is currently spent on frontline services, as opposed to what proportion is currently spent on law reform?
Well, I think that last question, do you know what proportion is going frontline?
There was a time, Senator, in about 5 years ago when the program had a separate allocation for policy reform activities. That was around about $2.1 million then. However, it's a question of definition. Clearly there's significant amounts of resources that go into responding to government questions on particular issues, on law reform initiatives. It'd be impossible for us to estimate just exactly how much effort goes into precisely that issue, because the program now, of course, is fused. There's no separate allocation for that.
Thank you, because my understanding is that that's a term that's been used to suggest that these cuts wouldn't affect frontline services, but in fact, if it's not possible to determine what proportion of the program goes to each, that would be difficult then to determine, I would have thought.
Yes, Senator, that's true.
Now, I think, Senator Wright, it also depends in part about what you mean by frontline services. And I know that you, Senator, chaired the Senate Select Committee into Access to Justice, which reported earlier this year, and I'm a great admirer of your committee's report, and you treated frontline services in a particular way. I think you probably are aware of my views, which is that frontline services should be given preference over the other services, including, this is controversial I know, but including advocacy work that legal assistance providers provide, because my own view is that it is more socially just if the limited amount of money available, which doesn't meet the demands upon it, is exhausted on casework and frontline services rather than other things which, although arguably worthwhile, are not as pressing.
Can I just be, that's interesting, because it's not actually a phrase that I tend to use. It's a phrase that I think others are more likely to use. Well, I used it because that's in fact a term that's been, I understand, been discussed in the context of these budget cuts. And my argument, or my concern, and the concern of some of the people that I've been talking to about, who are concerned about Indigenous justice and Indigenous incarceration rates, is that well, clearly it's apparently difficult to determine anyway what part of that program is devoted to law reform and policy and what part is devoted to so-called frontline services. Well, but as well as that, I will ask a question, and that is, have there been any predictions sought or any work been done about how those cuts, if they were to go ahead, and that was the figure that was actually provided, would be likely to impact on Indigenous incarceration rates, which we all know are highly disproportionate at the moment in Australia? So what would be the effects of those cuts if they were to go ahead?
Very good question.
Well, we haven't done any work on that, Senator. That would be quite a complicated exercise, actually, and might
an important one, I'd suggest, though, to have a look at.
It is an important question, but I mean, it's very complicated. It would be very complicated to try and trace out what might be the implications of funding cuts of this type in legal aid to.
Well, perhaps I might ask you to, given that that was the figure that was initially provided, and we don't have any certainty that that isn't the figure that will be cut, it may well not be, we're hearing now, I would ask you to take on notice some kind of modelling about what the effect might be, because you'd be in the position to be able to determine what are frontline services and what are law reform and policies.